Without any further delay, we would like to call upon Miss Robin Happel to deliver her insightful speech. Miss Happel, are you with us? Can you say
Yes.
hi to our audience?
Hello. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Good evening where you are and good morning where I am. I'm going to take a moment to,
Okay,
would it be
okay, take
possible
a.
to make screen sharing? Sorry.
No, please go on.
Yeah, so could you maybe enable screen sharing, please?
Yes, yes. All right, it
Uh,
is on it. Okay, dear audience, meanwhile, I would like to inform you that if you have any question or any key takeaway from Miss Happel's speech, please do mention it in our comment chat box, or you can also unmute yourself or turn on your video and share.
so
Okay,
thank you again for inviting me. Really an honor to be here. Um, so the title of this presentation today is Inspiring Climate Actions. I grew up in coal country, and my home country. So basically, I'm from East Tennessee, and we've historically been the site of a lot of fossil fuel extraction within the United States. And I know that also the United States is like one of the largest historical emitters. So I feel like a great responsibility as someone in that context to take action on climate, especially for a lot of my friends in the global South and elsewhere who are really on the front lines of this crisis. So briefly about me, thank you again for that very kind introduction. I work with the UN Association of the United States. They're also a global organization as well. This picture was taken at a summit they did pre-COVID in New York in the UN headquarters there. It was a really wonderful event. The UN also live streams a lot of their events on UN Web TV if you're interested in like seeing how that process works. And additionally, I have a little bit of research background. I was an expert reviewer for the AR6 this past spring. Unfortunately, reviewers can't talk about the report publicly until it's out, which should be later this summer. But if you're interested in discussing kind of more wonky science, I'm right there with you. I think it's really a fascinating field. So I wanted to begin with kind of some concrete areas that I think youth activists are really making a lot of difference in. And I know that Greenlead mentioned earlier they had an art contest, and I think this is something that's really so powerful. As I said on the slide, like art has really been a tool of social change in many social movements throughout history. This design here is from the global climate strike in New York in September 2019. I went to an art build with some local activists in New York City. I'm doing this really beautiful screen printing, and that was at the time one of the largest really climate strikes in the world. So I think that that really made a concrete impact. If you look at policy in the US, if you look at policy around the world, I think that really did galvanize many leaders to pay more attention to this issue. Additionally, if you're interested in kind of other art contests, Say It With Science is a campaign of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is responsible for the AR6 I mentioned previously, and the UN Foundation. And they're accepting rolling art submissions through the rest of the year through sayitwithscience.org. This is a little polar bear postcard I sent them around Earth Day in my country. And Greenpeace also is having a hashtag Draw the Oceans kind of celebration across social media. So I think this is something that's really taken off during lockdown as well, because so many of us are online and like so many of these social networks are so visual. And there's a lot of really exciting art and activism that's come out during lockdown. Additionally, Greenlead has a number of really wonderful educational resources as well. Learning climate science, it's really kind of an evolving field over time. There's a lot more we're discovering now about tipping points, about biodiversity impacts. I think that really keeping up with the science and helping inform others is actually one of the most impactful things you can do as an individual. So very briefly, and I'm happy to send these slides also, and like I'll have some of my contact information at the end if you want to ask any other questions. NASA RSET is a really wonderful global program. They have free virtual trainings. They have participants from all over the world. Typically, I've seen in their trainings, they try to have a couple different times to be conscious of time zone. I took a training with them earlier this summer on fire, using satellite data to monitor fire and kind of how climate has impacted wildfires around the world. Additionally, the United Nations has many free resources as well. UNCC Learn is one of their maybe more famous. And there's also Infomia under the UN Environment Program. They have a really wonderful free certificate on climate law. If you're interested in learning more about kind of how the Paris Agreement works, it's very technical kind of international laws. They're a really wonderful resource. And Learning for Nature is under UN Development Program. They have a lot of podcasts on their work with indigenous people and ecosystem restoration around the world. I'm not as into podcasts myself. I know a number of people who love podcasts and are obsessed with them. So if you're a podcast person, maybe something to check out. Additionally, since I'm a law student, I just wanted to kind of briefly mention that another area where young people have been really incredibly influential is in youth climate litigation around the world. So Youth v. Gov, you can see here on the right, refers to Juliana v. US, which was a very famous public trust doctrine case in my home country. And unfortunately, they have run into a lot of procedural barriers, but there is some sense that the new president might try to settle that case with them. So that's very exciting. We're going to see how that evolves in the next year, the next few months. But very basically, that was a group of young people who were suing the United States government under the theory that the world's atmosphere is a public trust that should be preserved for future generations. And therefore, the government should do more to combat climate change. I'm also part of World's Youth for Climate Justice. You can see their website here with their acronym. And they're a group of law students really from around the world that was spearheaded originally by Pacific Islands students fighting climate change. And I attended actually the UN Youth Climate Summit with a couple of the Pacific Island students group members. They've done a lot of really inspiring work within Solomon Islands and Vanuatu and other small island states in the Pacific. And they're really hoping to take a youth climate case to an international court. So we'll see. It's kind of an uphill fight in some ways, but there is also a lot of momentum within the UN to take really bold action on climate. And that's partly because the Secretary General now is actually very sympathetic to youth climate activists. So if this is transitioning to the UN, if you're interested in the United Nations, there is a lot of interest, I know, within the United Nations of getting more young people involved. And one kind of concrete pathway for that is the UN Environment Program Major Group of Children and Youth. They have, I can put a link in the chat, but they have a really wonderful document now called the Youth for Nature Manifesto. So actually, I think I'll put the link at the end because I don't want to like draw attention away from the slide, sorry, but yeah, so it's really interesting. It talks a lot about a number of justice issues related to climate and environment. And it also talks about really ecosystem impacts. You can see this kind of cute chimpanzee design they created for it earlier this spring. And that's also free to join for individuals or organizations around the world. It's a very flexible time commitment. And they have a consulting status basically within the UN Environment Program. So you'll get to see kind of environmental policy documents within the UN before they're released, and you can comment on them either on behalf of yourself, your organization. So that's just been a really incredible network as well. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight a few other youth climate organizations in addition to Green Lead. I'm a climate reality leader, and they were originally more focused in the US. They were founded by Al Gore. And Al Gore seems to be like one of our more popular US politicians, at least on climate issues, I have to say. I've seen like sometimes at summits where Al Gore will come up to speak after like other US politicians, like you can kind of see people like milling around in the audience. And as soon as Al Gore is like, oh, Al Gore. I'm from Tennessee and he's from Tennessee, so I admire Al Gore. But Fridays for Future, also a very famous youth network. Uprising was started by Alexandra Villaseñor, who is a very influential climate activist in the United States. She's sometimes referred to kind of as our Greta. And yeah, I think a lot of youth activists are multiple networks. Again, it can be challenging with time zones. So I try to choose things that are free, that have somewhat flexible scheduling. Yeah, and I wanted to leave some space towards the end of my presentation for questions. So feel free to chime in. I love climate and advocacy work. I got started on a very grassroots level, and I'm really passionate about helping other people kind of find a place in this space. And I really think there is a place for everyone in this movement. So, if this is an area you're interested in, feel free to reach out to me. I put some of my social media handles here. And I believe the organizers have my contact information as well. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. And feel free to ask me any questions or type any questions in the chat.
Thank you, Ms. Happel, for this insightful speech. I personally found it very wonderful. I think our audience also feels the same way. Now, dear audience, if you have any key takeaways, please mention it in the chat box, or you can also turn your camera on and share it with us. And if you have any question as well, please type it down or do the same. We'll take a few minutes for that.
Also, this photo on the right, I don't know how bored you are during quarantine. I know many countries around the world are still dealing with the pandemic. Unfortunately, we do still have some cases where I live in Tennessee. But this is like kind of a very fun home craft project. So you can do like paper marbling at home if you have like a pan or a bowl of water. You can sprinkle, like I use like sidewalk chalk for this, but you can sprinkle like any kind of pigment across the water and let it swirl and just like dip paper into it, and creates this kind of very fun like tie-dye effect. So if you're looking for like new things to do at home, yeah, I know personally I didn't anticipate really being in this situation for a year. So again, really applaud the resilience of young people on this call. And yeah, anything I can do to support your journey, your climate advocacy.
So we have one question. So, hello, can we inspire our neighbors and people in our community to go for renewable energy sources instead of fossil fuel?
Yeah, so this is a really great question. I know where I live in Tennessee, we've started doing kind of community solar. So that basically means that if you can't afford to buy like a solar panel for your own roof, you can get kind of like a local solar installation that many people can kind of pool their money for. So this looks different in different countries because energy is typically like governed differently in different countries. I know more about energy law in my home country than Bangladesh and other countries around the world, but I think there are a lot of startups now that have local solar, so you can look into solar lanterns. Really, any small impact makes a difference. So like my family has a lot of like solar phone chargers that we'll use. You can just put it on a windowsill, and then if your phone runs down, that's like a really nice kind of like easy way to integrate solar into your everyday life. Yeah, so I think it's a journey. I know there are still some people who are very resistant to renewables, but I think as the cost has come down, that's been a really strong argument as well. In my family, when we bought into community solar in our community, our energy bills decreased by roughly half. Again, that kind of varies based on where you are, but there's a lot of opportunity for people who maybe want like a cheap way to charge their phone as well. Yeah, and a couple more great questions in the chat. Certification programs. So yeah, NASA, ARSA, I think they have like scheduled sessions. But most of the other programs I mentioned, I can type some of the names in the chat again, if that's helpful, are kind of like, you can look through their lessons whenever you want. They'll have like PDFs or slideshows just on their website. I think you should be able to Google these names as well. Infomia is like fairly unique. That should pop up. Yeah, so you can kind of click through whenever you want. It's like fairly low stress. I think some of them may have language availability other than English. I'm not 100% sure. I know a couple of these have at least Spanish, because Learning for Nature does a lot of work with like people in the Amazon in South America. Yeah, so it's really like self-paced. Some of them have quizzes, which is a little stressful, but a lot of them you can take the quizzes however many times you want, which is less stressful. Yeah, Climate Reality Project, they have like really wonderful global trainings. I was a mentor for one of their global trainings, and it really, it's a really inspiring virtual event. Yeah, so feel free to reach out to me as well with any questions. I think like especially if you're at home, in kind of the strange pandemic world we're in, it's a nice way to kind of feel connected and like build your skills, even when unfortunately we can't go to as many in-person events. I see someone's raising their hand as well. So I'm going to answer the question in the chat. Yeah, hi.
Hi, Miss Robin. What's up?
Hello.
Are you audible? Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. As you are a global goals ambassador for climate actions for UN Association of the United States, I have a question for you. So, according to the Global Climate Risk Index 2021, South Asian countries like Bangladesh, India are the most vulnerable to climate change. And every year we are seeing this. So, what do you think? Is UN playing the role effectively to combat the climate crisis in these less developed countries?
Yeah, so I think one thing that the UN has done is it's helped provide a framework for wealthier countries like mine to at least try to reduce our emissions. And I know, speaking as an American, we haven't done enough. And I know many of us are committed now that we have kind of a new president and a new administration to try to do more. I have a lot of friends in the Philippines. I worked, like one of my great mentors in law school is Tony Aposa, who's like an environmental lawyer in the Philippines. So I know that the situation in Southeast Asia has been very challenging, especially with many of the typhoons in recent years. And I think that in addition to kind of providing this negotiation framework for the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC and these other climate agreements, the UN has also gotten a lot of private industry on board. So again, this is an area where really more needs to be done. But through kind of like the Global Compact and these other UN bodies, they have at least encouraged some private corporations to decrease their own emissions. So I know there's a lot of, I think, valid criticism that some companies kind of like to greenwash, but I think at least if you're creating that incentive, then there is an incentive for some of them to take real action. Let me see if there's more questions in the chat. Oh, and feel free. I think your hand is still raised, so I don't know if you still want to chime in.
Okay,
yeah.
so there is another question. Do you think we can produce sustainable renewable energy for a clean earth?
Yeah, so I see a couple questions in the chat. There's also someone who asked best experience. Just very briefly, I think one of my best experiences was the UN Youth Climate Summit. I think I'm just like very nostalgic for any in-person event I went to before COVID. That was like the fall before COVID hit New York. And I'm just like, I miss going places and eating food at those places. But anyway, I think it was really inspiring to see kind of more inclusion of students from around the world. Because within the US, a lot of our climate organizations are kind of more focused on the US, which makes sense because we're like historically the world's largest emitter, but it's also nice to have that more global perspective. And it was just a really celebratory energy. And I think that's something that's sometimes lacking is a lot of young people who are really passionate about this space don't give themselves credit for how like inspiring they are. And like for everyone in this call, like you took your evening to come to this event. You didn't have to do that. So like give yourself a pat on the back that you're committed in that way. And then the next question, innovative technologies. I think there's a lot that's been done with renewables really around the world. We've seen the price fall greatly, which is significant because now these technologies are more able to compete with fossils and in many cases outcompete fossils. So one interesting thing I've seen with solar is there are companies now that make like translucent or transparent solar panels. So hopefully someday you could put those on like the windows of an office building and actually have like that kind of different energy integration. I've also done a little bit of work with an organization called the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. I can type that in the chat. This is like a much more controversial topic. I should say that they don't take any set policy positions. Their goal is to provide like a forum for discussion, basically, but they look at actually like climate altering technologies as well, if that's something you're interested in. So that can be everything from like planting mangroves and reforestation to these kind of very like sci-fi solutions, like let's suck CO2 out of the air, which some companies are doing, or like, how do we maybe like put a tarp over the Arctic to stop it from melting, which I haven't seen anyone really come up with an exact plan for how to do that, but there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of interesting technical discussions out there, some more theoretical than others. How do you increase, have you overcome the obstacles? Yeah, these are all really wonderful questions. This is like such a thought-provoking group, but okay. I'm just going to go in order in the chat. What's your suggestion for developing countries like us? The group I've done some work with, Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change. I know one of their like slogans, if you like look them up on Twitter or other social media, it's like often in their banner image is like, be brave, be loud. And I think that as especially young people on the front lines, you really are like the conscience of the world. And the Secretary General of the UN and other very influential officials have really said that, like, youth activists really are driving action. Like, you are the conscience of a lot of these leaders at this point. So I would say, like, don't be afraid to speak up. Like I mentioned, I grew up in a community that's historically suffered from a lot of coal extraction and a lot of the kind of health and environmental impacts that go along with that. So I try to build that into like why I'm interested in this issue. And I think that, especially if you're someone who has been personally impacted, that's a very powerful story to tell. And there are kind of more international organizations now that are interested, that either already have a global network or are interested in being more global. And I know, like, as an American, a lot of our climate organizations, this has been kind of a conversation that we need to shift to more of a justice perspective and be more inclusive of people around the world. And additionally, adopting cleaner energy. There are really innovative like startups around the world. So I know in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there's, I follow them on Instagram, actually. They have like a really inspiring Instagram, just typing in the chat, Solar Sister. So they work with predominantly women to sell like small scale solar panels that are affordable for families. And I also did a little bit of work in undergrad with a UN Foundation Clean Cook Stove program. So that's also like really impactful in a lot of countries. Like women and children are kind of disproportionately exposed to cook stove smoke. So that's like another area where clean fuel and clean energy are really important. Yeah, and again, like I realize a lot of these, like each of these questions could be like such a long, fascinating discussion. So if there's anything I didn't touch on in your question, or you want to reach out to me, feel free. Like, I think the organizers have my contact information as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time, for answering so many questions. So if your audience, if you have any other questions, you can reach Robin Happel directly. We will be sharing the contact info with you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Robin Happel, and everyone in the audience for so many questions. Okay, so now